Within 1 galactic hour of sending the declaration of war, the fleet jumped into the system towards that strange blue and green ball that floated in space. This was strange to see, but stranger still was the fact that when they arrived with all weapons primed, ready to fire at the fleet that would be waiting for them. But there was nothing. Nothing was there. Nothing floated in space except simple debris. The stray asteroid, a comet way out far enough that it couldn't be possibly a threat. There was nothing. There was simply a small protective almost shield in the way of an asteroid belt. On further inspection, they saw that 2 planets had seemingly collided and created this asteroid belt. Boy, this was a strange sector to be in. As they continued to get closer, which took several more standard hours, they saw something, or the lack of something, that was also strange. There was no defense satellites. There was satellites, yes, but most of them were seemingly communication satellites. They didn't have any defenses, save for 1 or 2 of them, and their weapons seemed to be pointing in the wrong direction. It was very odd to see. Along with that, none of the satellites, as they got close, set out their own sentry drones. This was amazing. The command crew couldn't understand what was going on. The captain constantly scratched at their antennae as they wondered what in the holy hell was going on. What in the ever-loving maker is going on here? It shouldn't be this simple. If this keeps up, they should be able to make landfall with 100% of their forces. And if that was the case, well, there's no way they could lose. With that, they sent down the standard decree that they would be taking over the planet. And on the way down, they believed nothing would be more simple than taking this whole world. However, there was a small issue. The issue being is that there are multiple continents on this planet. 7, in fact. 7 entire continents. This was never seen anywhere before. They didn't understand what was going on, so they began to scan to see where the primary base was, where the capital was, where they would find the fortress, where they would find the holdouts. This was incredibly important, as they would need to take out the stronghold to force the surrender. As they scanned the surface just before the invasion, they realized that there was multiple strongholds all over each of the continents. How was this even possible? No one ever did that. Did they know that they were coming? Did these creatures of this planet know they were coming? They couldn't. They don't even seem to be a spacefaring race yet. How could they possibly have seen it? Looking at it, they realized that out of the 7 continents, one of these must be the largest one, must be the one they aim for. And if they can't find the largest one, then the one centrally located, or the one most populous, must be it. So, they began to send down their groups, splitting the fleet into 7 sections. This would actually make the forces smaller than attacking a single group after facing a fleet, as they would still have 100%, but now each of them barely holding 15. Now they went towards the surface, but believed that their drones would be able to sweep across the area without any issue. As each of the corvettes, frigates, and destroyers started to break through the atmosphere, the battleships were very short behind them. They had to wait until they were within the atmosphere before they could use their main cannons. This was galactic law. This was warfare. This was the way their convention was, and they would not even bend it a little bit, even for this brand new species that seemed to not know anything about galactic civility, and that the targets should only be the drones, and you never ever target the bridge of the ship. They knew this, so with full confidence they headed towards the surface. And as they began to break through the surface, several areas began to light up. Screaming at them was all sorts of sensors and warnings as different type of ordnance and aircraft began to get closer and closer, some of them seeming to drop several different types of ordnance as they got close. They were well beyond visual range, and several of the drones that could fly within atmosphere and the aerospace fighters were simply launched to try and take these out. They didn't have much of a chance to actually stop them, as these things were so large and so fast. They came in screeching towards each of the destroyers, frigates, and so on. And as they crashed in, there was a mighty fireball that burst the ship into many, many, many pieces. They didn't understand what was going on. This did not play out exactly around the entirety of the globe, but out of all 7 of their targets, at least 6 of them were being covered in aircraft. And with that, there was ordnance coming from the aircraft that seemed to be flying and guiding its way in. They couldn't understand. Sending the drones basically to protect them. Many of them were cut to pieces and just knocked to the side by this ordnance as it came in, smashing into the side of another destroyer, and the destroyer simply fell apart several pieces as it plummeted to the ground, taking all its drones and everything else with it. The crew realized that they needed to bring out the big guns. Though as they saw more of their cruisers and destroyers be blown to pieces and plummet towards the surface, they realized they had to expedite this very quickly, as their percentage of losses was climbing exceptionally fast. With that, the order was sent, and all the ships that were already in the atmosphere simply turned their noses towards the ground and fired their engines, trying to get to the ground as fast as possible. In some cases, this made the ordnance coming in simply miss, but not always. The ordnance that was coming in would change direction, sometimes instantly, and crash in, taking another one of their ships down with it. This was astounding. But the attackers believed that they had the ability to take out whatever was coming. They pushed their own battleships faster towards the ground, and then suddenly realized with a massive jerk as they began to fly towards their own ceiling that something was off. The sensors kicked in and they realized this was a high gravity world. If they sent their ships in too fast, they wouldn't be able to pull up. They sent the message to all their drones to pull out of their dives and land as fast as possible. Unfortunately for some, this did not quite make it. Some simply crashed straight into their target city, and they simply exploded, knocking over several buildings in the process as they screeched in, all of them firing their weapons as they came in, some firing their retros as they tried desperately to slow down. A few were able to actually successfully flip and burn, and in some cases were able to slow down enough to simply roll over and land. This is what the opposing force wanted. They wanted to get their own forces on the ground as fast as possible. And as they staggered to their feet, trying to handle the extreme pull of this planet's gravity, they realized that much of their forces had finally reached the ground. The very first to be reached, was the largest and most dense city they could find. They looked on their map as they looked through all the GPS data they could, and they realized that the humans called this Mumbai. It was an extremely dense area. It was extremely populated, and this would be an issue. They looked, and it didn't seem to have a lot of defenses, yet for some reason there was a lot of machines moving in. From the shoreline, they could also see vessels moving in. This was odd. Did they send their drones outside of their protective zones? These creatures are strange. But the attackers believed that their forces would be unbeatable once they disembarked. The ramps immediately dropped, and drones began to crawl and roll out. Some on tracks, some on wheels, some on legs, but all of them armed, targeting anything they could. Anything they didn't perceive as a threat was left alone, but anything that even thought to be a threat was simply fired upon. With that, a bunch of drones were walking down the street as they saw something large and metal heading their way. They didn't know if this was a threat or not. But as they looked over, those in charge saw that another ship had landed, another group had landed, this time in Kensan, in the Republic of Congo. This landed with a bit of a thump, as the ground itself was not directly designed for this type of pressure. Many of it skidded to a stop. Some of the forces where they landed simply sunk down into the area. Some of it was wrapped up inside the foliage as they tried to get down. As it reached out, and it seemed as though the trees, as they swung back and forth, would grab onto the stabilizers and simply pull them sideways. The drones, unable to comprehend what was going on, would not be able to compensate before the ship itself would crash into the ground, not destroying the ship, but simply immobilizing it. With that, the command staff was worried about the rest of them. The ones that were sent to the southern continent seemed to face absolutely zero issue. The small colonies that were there were barely more than small huts. They believed this would make it easy for them to take, and they were right. The only issue they had was the fact that they were not ready for the extreme conditions, as it was the winter time in that area. As soon as they shut off their engines, the drones had no idea what they were in for. As they disembarked, they realized that a lot of the fluids used inside the drones began to simply freeze. The walking drones were the first ones, the rolling were the second, and those on tracks didn't make it back to the ship to try and warm back up. Many of them tried to overheat their systems, trying desperately to get their systems to work again, but the joints, the gears, everything was frozen. And with a massive amount of wind pushing them over, this was a losing gambit. They looked further, and they saw that another continent had been landed. This strange-looking island they call Australia. They landed almost on top of this odd amphitheater-looking device, and they began to blast forward. They didn't realize that this was going to be one of the worst areas, as not only were the locals a little bit ready, but those who were not running away were running towards them. Were these threats? With that, another set of signals just off the coast, and they saw that several other vessels were already on their way. Wait a minute. Are those vessels drones or not? It doesn't matter. On their vid screens, they were shooting and blasting away. This was something they were worried about. More and more of the guidance ordnance went up and started smashing into the side of those landing ships. The ships that had not made planetfall yet were trying desperately to support those that were on the ground, yet they faced more and more issues. They tried to get on the ground to get below the ordnance that was flying, and some of them just didn't make it. The command staff, still tucked inside one of their own battleships, was quickly trying to lower itself down to one of the areas they believed would be easier. They looked closer, and they could see that there was two continents joined by a tiny sliver of a landmass. If they were going to be able to make it, this is where they were going to. As the ones on the southern area tried to land, they began to check the map, and as that one touched down, they saw it was something called a Sepalo. Sepalo, they couldn't pronounce the name. It was in a country that had a very easy name to pronounce, as it was the name of the captain's daughter, Brazil. They thought this was kind of funny and would be simply easy, but as their ships landed, they realized that they were facing more issues than they thought. As the doors opened, many of the drones were simply cut apart as many ballistic rounds began to cut through each of them. They couldn't understand where it was coming from. The drones were trying desperately to find anything, but there was so much movement around that it overloaded their sensors. They couldn't figure out where the shots were coming from. Many of the drones simply would lose a leg or lose a track or simply get blown in half or worse. The ones inside the command battleship aimed for the northern sector. They were going to aim at one place they called Oklahoma City. They couldn't understand the name and were having a lot of trouble dealing with the language. They had trouble because their multiple mandibles would not allow them to say this right. However, when they landed, they believed that this had to be it. It was centrally located. It was a major city. It was all built up with steel and concrete. This had to be it. As they made their way down, they didn't realize what shitstorm they were heading for. As they finally got down halfway through the atmosphere, they were hit with so much ordnance that most of the command crew was knocked right out of their seats and crashed into the side walls, into the bulkheads. They went flying. and into the consoles they crashed as well. Many of them hitting commands on their consoles that they weren't supposed to or didn't want to, causing the ship itself to drift and list in one way, or causing a few of the other destroyers and cruisers to simply do something strange. In one case, it accidentally shut down all the drones in one area. Forcing a quick restart, they quickly found out that almost 15% of their drones had been neutralized in the approximate 2 minutes from the time of realizing what had just happened to getting everything restarted. It was absolute chaos. Landing, they could see all the fighting happening down below. They tried desperately to get their battleship to the surface, using its larger weapons to fire down into the stronghold. They believed that they could take this one. This one was far away from the rest, had a smaller population density. At least if they took this one, there would be a foothold on this planet. But as they finally went down, they might realize that they might have fucked around and found out something very bad, as dozens of guided munitions crashed into the side of their battleship, launching it from side to side. Eventually, ground fire was reaching up and striking with just as much, if not more, force, and then it came screaming down. The crew, for the first time in decades, felt something in a battle they had not felt before: fear. The fear as their ship plummeted towards the surface. Their helmsman was able to pull out of the dive and slide the battleship to a stop, ripping off all the ventral guns in the process. But they didn't care. They immediately deployed as many drones as possible. But as soon as their ship stopped, they were already starting to be hit with some sort of ground fire. Something was coming over the hill and striking down on them. They couldn't see anything. They tried to use their point defense systems to fire up at the aircraft that were coming in, but none of them came in close enough. One of them tried, and then seemingly shot some sort of smoke out of the nose. And before they even realized what happened, multiple rounds punched through the battleship like it was paper and ripped all the way to the ground. They realized at this point that they were not going to be able to get the ships off the surface. They tried desperately to tell all the battleships to lift off, get the hell off this rock. They were desperate, looking for anyone who could lift off, possibly to come and get them, as they knew they had to get gone. Only one ship was able to lift off, the one that was over in that strange island. But that strange island, its inhabitants had come out and started using melee weapons. They had to change all the civilians to hostiles before the drones actually began to fight back in earnest. But even as they did, they began to look on the video feed, and at first it was something odd. They couldn't figure out what was going on. And then they realized something simple. As one of the drones was knocked off to the side, its camera was still operating. It looked up, and they could see others of this species running over. They paused the video and couldn't believe it. Their drones, their standard drones, only came up to the knees of this species, maybe a little higher. They were massive. This species was gigantic. Even their dreadnought drones were only about the size, or maybe 80%, of the standard that they were seeing. These dreadnought drones had massive cannons, but these cannons were able to fire 4 or 5 times, but they were immediately targeted. Some of them would swarm in with melee tactics. Some would grab a hold of a drone and throw it at this juggernaut. Some of them would stand off at a distance and use their own ballistic weapons to blow it to frickin' pieces. They were now petrified, and many of those inside the citadel of this battleship began to not only shake but lose control of themselves and faint. They could only watch as around the world a single battleship tried desperately to reach beyond the atmosphere, as they realized that they could get into safety if they got out of here. But the high gravity of the planet meant that it was moving very, very slow, even at full burn. Just as it got halfway out of the atmosphere, tragedy struck as more of the guided munitions came in, but this time they could see that those aircraft were coming in much, much closer. Some of them deciding to use their ballistic weapons attached to them. This was madness. They looked over, and sure enough, they paused the video again, and they could see that these were not drones. these were manned. These were controlled by these monsters, these giants. This world of giants they had come to conquer, but they had no idea. They had not set up enough reconnaissance and in their haste had doomed an entire invasion force. In fact, due to the fact that there were 7 continents, they doomed multiple invasion forces. On the ground, the humans used everything at their disposal. Their bare hands, sticks, guns, cannons, Molotov cocktails. It didn't matter. If they could find a way to use a weapon, they did, to smash these little robots to pieces. Many of them laughing while they did it as they kicked one over and starting to raise their hands up straight into the air, palms together, fingers extended, and yelling something strange. Touchdown! They couldn't understand what the hell was going on. How could they have missed this? How could they not know that the biomechanics on this planet would have allowed for giants like this? No other species known to them was this large. And now they had their ships. The crew inside was shaking uncontrollably as the ship itself began to be torn apart. They could see through the exterior cameras several of these massive bipedal beings walking forward, many of them dressed all in the same type of clothing, though clothing was very rarely used for other species. It was clear that this was some sort of protection. They looked and they could see this creature bring out some large piece of metal, seemingly jamming it inside the ship as it shook as it hit, and then began to push down, and the metal itself began to creak and rip open. Eventually, these brawny hands reached and ripped the side open with a mighty groan, and the crew was exposed to the light. The light burned them, as they were not used to this high of intensity of sunlight coming down. It burned, and they tried to hide themselves. One of these bipedals, surprisingly, raised up its arm, moving its clothing to the side to shield them from the sun's rays. Realizing that the UV radiation might be toxic, it simply looked down. This is what we're fighting against? These little... Okay, this is hilarious. As the crew was brought into interrogation, it took a while before translation was started, and at that time, the ships were being cannibalized. The drones were being pulled apart to see how they tick. And of course, the computer core, which unfortunately for the invaders was not wiped clean, was being analyzed. Everything was now there. Their history, their science, their technology. And now these giants, these beasts that simply threw away caution and moved in. One of them sat on the other side of a strange metal, what they called table, and simply looked at him. The captain, being afraid that he was now separated from his command crew, as they were each obviously going to be interrogated, was surprised to be treated with such respect, as they were not tortured, they were not killed, they were not forced to divulge any information. The one in front of them simply started by asking a simple question. What the fuck were you thinking?